Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into one of the most incredible and unsolved mysteries in aviation history, a case that feels like it was taken straight out of a Hollywood thriller, but actually happened in real life. It is the story of a man who boarded a plane on a rainy afternoon in November 1971, and then vanished without a trace. His name, or at least the name he used, would go down in history: D.B. Cooper. Let us go back to November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving in the United States. At Portland International Airport, everything seemed ordinary. Travelers were heading home to see their families, others were going on short business trips, and a small Boeing 727 was preparing for a short flight to Seattle. Among the passengers boarding Flight 305 was a man in his mid-40s, dressed neatly in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie. He carried a simple briefcase and looked, at first glance, like any other businessman catching a quick flight. To the crew and fellow passengers, there was nothing unusual about him. He purchased his ticket with cash, something far more common back then than it is today, and he gave his name as Dan Cooper. He took his seat in the rear of the aircraft, ordered a drink, and waited quietly as the flight prepared for departure. No one on board could have guessed that this seemingly ordinary man was about to become the central figure in one of the boldest and most mysterious crimes the world had ever seen. Flight 305 took off on schedule, carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members. The short trip from Portland to Seattle was expected to last less than an hour. But for this particular flight, history would take a dramatic turn. At some point after takeoff, the man known as Dan Cooper would set his plan into motion, a plan so daring, so meticulously thought out, that it would leave the FBI chasing answers for decades. Imagine being on that flight. The hum of the engines fills the cabin. The stewardesses are moving up and down the aisle, serving drinks and making sure everyone is comfortable. Outside, the weather is cloudy, but nothing unusual. Then, in the back of the plane, a man in a black tie leans forward and quietly hands a folded note to a flight attendant. At first, she thinks it is just another passenger leaving a phone number or a small message. But when she looks down, the words on the paper change the course of aviation history forever. That was the moment when Flight 305 went from being an ordinary holiday trip to becoming the stage for one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of all time. As the flight attendant glanced back at the man in seat 18C, she could not help but notice how composed he looked. Unlike the image many people imagine when they think of a hijacker, nervous, aggressive, or unpredictable, this man was the exact opposite. He was calm, polite, and strangely unremarkable. Witnesses later described him as being in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, with neatly combed dark hair and a clean-shaven face. His suit was pressed, his black tie perfectly straight, and his demeanor almost gentlemanly. In fact, in the early moments of the flight, nothing about him suggested danger. He ordered a bourbon and soda, lit a cigarette, something still allowed on airplanes in the 1970s, and sat quietly, watching the clouds pass outside his window. He did not pace the aisle. He did not draw attention to himself, and he certainly did not appear anxious. To the crew, he looked like a businessman traveling for work, maybe on his way to a meeting in Seattle. But when that note was passed to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, everything changed. Written in neat capital letters, it carried a chilling message. The man was carrying a bomb. At first, Schaffner tucked the note into her pocket without reading it, assuming it was a phone number or a simple flirtation. But Cooper leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you would better look at that note. I have a bomb." When she unfolded the paper, her hands shook. Inside was a clear message of demand. Cooper calmly instructed her to sit beside him, then discreetly opened his briefcase just enough for her to see what appeared to be red sticks of dynamite and wires connected to a battery. He did not raise his voice, did not panic, and did not act violently. He simply showed her enough to prove he was serious. From that moment forward, the atmosphere on the plane changed, but only for the crew. Interestingly, the passengers remained unaware of the situation. Cooper had made it clear, he wanted things handled quietly, without alarming anyone else on board. He told Florence exactly what to relay to the captain. He wanted $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck ready in Seattle to refuel the plane for the next leg of his plan. What stood out most was his precise control. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he asked for it with an almost professional courtesy. The flight attendants later said he was never rude, never raised his voice, and even went out of his way to make them feel calm. At one point, he offered to pay for his drink. At another, he reassured one of the crew members that everything would be fine if they simply followed instructions. This was not the behavior of a desperate criminal acting recklessly. It was the behavior of someone who had thought through every step, someone with confidence, patience, and most intriguingly knowledge of how planes operated. For example, Cooper seemed familiar with the Boeing 727's unique rear staircase, a feature that could be lowered during flight. Few passengers, or even ordinary pilots, would have known such a detail. The more time the crew spent with him, the stranger the situation became. Here was a man in the middle of committing a major federal crime. Yet he carried himself with the calm presence of a man simply executing a business plan. He smoked his cigarettes, sipped his drink, and gave instructions with a steady tone. As the plane continued its short journey toward Seattle, the crew followed his instructions to the letter. The passengers, still unaware of the drama unfolding at the back of the plane, continued their flight in peace. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, authorities on the ground scrambled to gather the ransom money and the parachutes. In less than an hour, Flight 305 would land in Seattle, and the second act of Cooper's daring plan would begin. By the time Flight 305 approached Seattle, the tension in the cockpit and cabin crew had reached its peak. Cooper's demands had been relayed to authorities on the ground, and the entire situation now rested on how quickly they could respond. What made his request unusual was not just the money, it was the parachutes. Cooper had asked for $200,000 in cash, a staggering sum in 1971, worth more than $1 million today. But instead of asking for a single parachute to make his escape, he requested 4. This detail immediately caught the attention of investigators. Why 4 parachutes? Was he planning to take hostages with him? Was he bluffing to confuse the authorities, or was it simply a clever trick to ensure he was not handed faulty equipment? By making the unusual demand, Cooper put pressure on the FBI. If they gave him just 1 parachute, law enforcement might be tempted to sabotage it, ensuring his escape would fail. But by asking for 4, he created uncertainty. What if he forced a crew member or passenger to jump with him? No one could take the risk of tampering with the gear. It was a brilliant move, calculated, precise, and completely in line with the cool, strategic persona he had shown so far. As the passengers enjoyed what they thought was an ordinary flight, the crew carried the weight of this secret. They worked hard to keep the cabin calm, not letting anyone know that a hijacking was underway. Meanwhile, on the ground in Seattle, law enforcement, FBI agents, and airline staff scrambled to gather the ransom money. They collected $200,000 in $20 bills, each note carefully photographed so that any future discovery could be traced. The parachutes were sourced from a nearby skydiving school. And although authorities worried about giving Cooper real equipment that might help him succeed, they had little choice. His plan was already in motion. And any sign of resistance could put lives at risk. As the 727 descended towards Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, Cooper remained calm. He gave clear instructions to the pilots: keep the cabin lights dimmed, land on a remote runway, and taxi to a quiet section where a fuel truck and the money would be waiting. When the plane finally touched down, a strange calm hung in the air. Police and FBI agents kept their distance, watching from the shadows, following Cooper's exact instructions not to approach too closely. What followed was almost surreal. The ransom money and parachutes were brought on board, delivered discreetly by airline staff. Cooper examined them carefully but without fuss. Then, as he had promised, he allowed the 36 passengers to disembark safely. No one was harmed, no weapons were brandished in the open, and most of those passengers had no idea until later that they had been part of one of the boldest hijackings in history. Only the crew remained, the pilots, the flight engineer, and 2 flight attendants. With the cabin cleared and the ransom secured, Cooper's plan moved into its second stage. He instructed the pilots to prepare the plane for departure once again. This time, however, he had very specific instructions for how the aircraft should be flown. He wanted the plane to take off toward Mexico City, flying at a low altitude of around 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down, the wing flaps set at 15 degrees. And the cabin unpressurized. These were not random demands. They were highly technical details requests that made it clear Cooper knew exactly how the Boeing 727 operated. And then came the most critical part of his instructions: he wanted the rear staircase lowered mid-flight. The passengers were gone, the money was on board, and the parachutes lay neatly beside Cooper's seat. The crew, though tense, noticed how little he seemed rattled by the extraordinary situation. He calmly finished his drink, adjusted his tie, and then gave the order for takeoff. But this was no ordinary flight. Cooper's instructions to the pilots were precise, almost as though he had studied the aircraft beforehand. He wanted the plane to fly south toward Mexico. But with very unusual settings: an altitude of 10,000 feet, a speed no faster than 200 knots, landing gear extended, wing flaps at 15 degrees. And the cabin pressure left low. These adjustments were not random. They were conditions that would make it possible for him to attempt something no hijacker had tried before: an escape by parachute. The pilots objected at first, pointing out that with the rear staircase deployed, it was not safe to take off. Cooper, however, remained firm. After some back and forth, a compromise was reached: the plane would take off normally, but once airborne, Cooper would lower the staircase himself. He seemed to know this aircraft. The Boeing 727 had a unique design that allowed such a maneuver. At approximately 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 once again took off from Seattle, heading south into the rainy November night. Only 5 people remained on board now: Captain William Scott, First Officer Bob Radazak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and 2 flight attendants, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner. The cabin was eerily quiet. save for the steady roar of the engines and the occasional command from the mysterious man in the back. As the plane leveled off, Cooper ordered Tina to join him. He instructed her to sit across from him while he carefully reviewed the parachutes. At one point, he even attempted to tie some of the parachute cords together, as if preparing for his daring jump. His movements were deliberate, methodical, without a trace of panic. To Tina, it was as though he was rehearsing steps he had practiced long before that night. Around 8:00 p.m., somewhere over southern Washington, Cooper sent Tina to the cockpit with a final message: stay inside and keep the door closed. She obeyed, leaving Cooper alone in the rear of the plane. A few minutes later, the cockpit crew noticed a sudden change in air pressure and the faint rumble of shifting weight. Warning lights in the cockpit indicated that the rear staircase had been deployed. The pilots tried to call back to him, but there was no reply. Then, not long after 8:10 p.m., they felt the plane jolt violently as if a heavy load had been removed from the back. Captain Scott steadied the aircraft. But no one needed to guess what had just happened. Somewhere in the darkness, above thick forests and rough terrain, D.B. Cooper had leapt into the night, disappearing into wind and rain with $200,000 strapped to his body. For the crew, it was a surreal moment. 1 minute, a man was on board orchestrating one of the most daring crimes in aviation history. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the stormy November sky. The plane continued on toward Reno, Nevada, where it finally landed safely just after 10 p.m. But when FBI agents rushed on board, they found only an empty seat, an unused parachute, and a mystery that would baffle investigators for decades. D.B. Cooper had vanished. When Flight 305 finally touched down in Reno, Nevada, the atmosphere inside the cockpit was tense but strangely quiet. The crew, who had followed Cooper's every instruction, were exhausted. FBI agents, state troopers, and local police swarmed the runway, ready to storm the plane. But when they rushed inside, they found exactly what the crew had already reported. Cooper was gone. The rear staircase was still lowered, a chilling reminder of how he had vanished into the storm. On one of the seats lay an unused parachute. A black tie clip was left behind, along with a cigarette butt in an ashtray. Aside from those small traces, there was nothing. The man known as D.B. Cooper had disappeared as if into thin air. Within hours, the FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Dozens of agents were dispatched across Washington and Oregon, searching the heavily forested wilderness where they believed Cooper had jumped. Helicopters swept the area. Ground teams pushed through thick woods, rivers, and mountains. Paratroopers and experienced outdoorsmen were consulted. But despite days of searching, no trace of Cooper was found. Investigators faced two burning questions: did he survive the jump, and if so, where did he go? On one hand, the odds were stacked against him. The night was stormy, the terrain was unforgiving, and Cooper was jumping into freezing temperatures with only a business suit and loafers. Even with experience, the risk of injury or death was extremely high. Many agents believed Cooper had not survived the fall at all. On the other hand, everything about his plan suggested careful preparation. He knew the details of the Boeing 727, he asked for multiple parachutes. And he seemed completely confident in what he was doing. If anyone could have pulled off such a dangerous stunt, it might have been him. The FBI began combing through passenger lists, background records, and suspects across the country. Hundreds of leads poured in from the public, each claiming to know who Cooper really was. Sketches of his face, drawn from crude descriptions, were plastered across newspapers and television broadcasts. D.B. Cooper became a household name overnight. But for every promising lead, there was a dead end. Some suspected he was a paratrooper or former military man with survival training. Others thought he might have been a disgruntled airline worker, or someone with deep knowledge of aviation. The FBI investigated over 800 suspects in the first few years, yet no one could be conclusively identified as Cooper. Adding to the mystery, no large portion of the ransom money was ever spent or tracked. Each of the bills had been recorded by serial number, yet they never surfaced in circulation. It was as if the $200,000 had disappeared along with him. For the American public, the case became a sensation. Newspapers ran daily updates. Television anchors described the manhunt as though it were a Hollywood movie. People debated endlessly, was D.B. Cooper a criminal mastermind who had outwitted the authorities, or just a reckless man whose plan ended in tragedy somewhere in the wilderness? And so, in the weeks following November 1971, the mystery deepened. The FBI had launched one of its most extensive investigations ever, but the man at the center of it, calm, polite, and unforgettable, remained as elusive as the night he vanished. Nearly a decade passed after that stormy night in 1971, and the mystery of D.B. Cooper seemed frozen in time. The FBI continued chasing leads, interviewing suspects, and re-examining evidence, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. It felt as though Cooper had simply vanished from history. That is, until a strange discovery in 1980 suddenly reignited the case. In February of that year, a young boy named Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family along the Columbia River in Washington state. As he dug into the sandy riverbank to build a campfire, he unearthed a small bundle wrapped in rubber bands. Inside were decaying, moldy stacks of $20 bills. When investigators examined them, the truth was shocking. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to D.B. Cooper 9 years earlier. In total, about $5,800 was recovered. The bills were water-damaged and partially deteriorated, but their identity was undeniable. For the first time, there was physical proof connecting Cooper's leap to the wilderness below. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. Why were only a few $1,000s found, and not the entire $200,000? Why were the bills buried in the sand, nearly 20 miles downstream from where investigators believed Cooper had jumped? And most importantly, was this evidence that Cooper had died in the fall, or could it mean he survived and intentionally hid part of the money? Experts debated endlessly. Some suggested the money had washed downstream over time, carried by floods or shifting river currents. Others believed it was deliberately buried, perhaps as a signal or a cache Cooper never returned to. The FBI examined the sand layers around the money and determined it had likely been deposited there years earlier. But how it ended up in that exact spot remained a mystery. This discovery sparked a new wave of theories. One group of investigators leaned toward the idea that Cooper had not survived the jump. They argued that the extreme weather, rough terrain, and lack of specialized gear made his survival nearly impossible. If he had died in the wilderness, perhaps animals or natural forces had scattered his remains and the money. But others were not so sure. They pointed out that Cooper's planning seemed too meticulous for him to have failed completely. He had chosen the Boeing 727 for its unique staircase, demanded multiple parachutes to prevent sabotage, and even specified the flight's speed and altitude. Could a man with such knowledge really have leapt blindly to his death? The discovery of the money also highlighted another puzzle. In all the years following the hijacking, not a single bill from Cooper's ransom ever appeared in circulation, with every serial number recorded. Any appearance in a bank, store, or casino would have been flagged immediately. Yet nothing surfaced except for those few stacks found by the riverbank. For the public, this only deepened the myth of D.B. Cooper. Was he a daring outlaw who managed to disappear into a new life, never spending the money to avoid detection? Or was he a tragic figure who met his end in the cold wilderness, his story left unfinished? Even with this clue, the case remained as unsolved as ever. The money found in 1980 was both a breakthrough and a dead-end proof that Cooper had made it at least partway through his escape, but also evidence that left investigators with more uncertainty than before. With the discovery of the ransom money in 1980, the FBI doubled down on its investigation. But if Cooper himself had managed to vanish, perhaps the key was hidden among the living. Over the decades, hundreds of names were put forward as possible suspects. Some were ordinary men with unusual pasts. Others were hardened criminals who seemed to fit the daring profile. Yet, despite the sheer number of leads, none could ever be proven beyond doubt. One of the most famous suspects was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a former Army veteran and helicopter pilot. Just 5 months after Cooper's hijacking, McCoy pulled off a strikingly similar crime, hijacking a Boeing 727, demanding $500,000, and parachuting away to freedom. Unlike Cooper, McCoy was caught and sentenced to prison, where he later died in a failed escape attempt. For many, the similarities were too close to ignore. Could McCoy and Cooper have been the same man? The FBI ultimately ruled him out, noting differences in appearance, demeanor, and age. Another intriguing figure was Dwayne Weber, a man who, on his deathbed in 1995, allegedly confessed to his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." His widow later recalled how he had recurring nightmares about leaving fingerprints on an airplane, and how he once took her to a spot near the Columbia River where the money was later discovered. Despite these chilling details, no hard evidence linked Weber to the crime. Then there was Kenneth Christensen, a former flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines, the very company Cooper had hijacked. Years after his death, his brother claimed Kenneth had admitted he was D.B. Cooper. Christensen matched some aspects of the description, had military experience, and had suddenly come into money after the hijacking. But again, the FBI dismissed the theory due to inconsistencies in witness descriptions. Other suspects ranged from career criminals to ordinary men with mysterious pasts. Some investigators speculated that Cooper may have been a former paratrooper or military survivalist, someone comfortable with the technical details of the jump. Others argued he could have been a disgruntled airline worker who knew the Boeing 727 inside out. Conspiracy theories also flourished. Some believed Cooper had perished that night and was never found because of the remote, unforgiving terrain. Others insisted he had survived, hidden his identity, and lived quietly under a new name. The fact that none of the ransom bills were ever spent in circulation only fueled the latter theory. Perhaps he had kept the money hidden, or maybe he had exchanged it through underground channels. In time, amateur sleuths, journalists, and even professional investigators began building their own cases around different suspects. Books were published, documentaries aired, and each new theory seemed to add another layer to the myth. Some pointed fingers at ex-convicts. Others at family men who had seemed too ordinary to raise suspicion. Each theory gained traction for a moment, only to collapse under lack of evidence. The truth was, D.B. Cooper had become larger than any single suspect. He was no longer just a man, he was a legend. And like all legends, the absence of a definitive answer only made the story more compelling. For the FBI, the frustration grew. Decades of investigation, countless suspects, and thousands of hours of detective work had brought them no closer to identifying the mysterious man who vanished into the night sky in 1971. The more they looked, the more elusive he became. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the FBI investigation into D.B. Cooper was running in circles. New suspects would appear, then quickly fade, and the trail had gone cold. But while investigators struggled, Cooper himself was quietly becoming something far greater than a criminal case file. He was transforming into a cultural legend. Unlike many hijackers of the era, Cooper had harmed no one. He released the passengers unharmed, remained polite to the crew, and carried out his plan with an almost cinematic style. This strange combination of daring outlaw and courteous gentleman made him stand apart. The public, rather than fearing him, seemed fascinated. To some, he was even a folk hero, an everyman who had pulled off the impossible and vanished into thin air. This fascination seeped into popular culture. Books about the case began to appear, each offering its own theory about who Cooper was and what happened to him. Journalists and amateur sleuths wrote countless articles, speculating about his survival. But it was not just books. The story of D.B. Cooper reached television and film as well. In the 1981 movie The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, Hollywood dramatized the hijacking as a thrilling adventure, portraying Cooper not as a criminal, but as a rebellious anti-hero outsmarting the system. Television shows ranging from Unsolved Mysteries to History Channel documentaries dedicated entire episodes to his case, keeping the mystery alive for new generations. Music was not immune to the legend either. Songs referenced D.B. Cooper as a symbol of rebellion, escape, or mystery. For some artists, he embodied the spirit of breaking free from authority, someone who had beaten the odds in spectacular fashion. Even comic books and cartoons picked up the story. Cooper's image as the man who vanished into the night sky fit perfectly into fictional narratives about secret agents, time travelers, or even science fiction twists. Over time, the line between fact and folklore blurred. D.B. Cooper became less of a real person and more of a character, part outlaw, part trickster, part ghost. In later years, references to D.B. Cooper even appeared in unexpected places. The popular TV show Prison Break hinted at his fate. The sitcom 30 Rock made comedic nods to him. And perhaps most famously, the blockbuster series Loki from Marvel directly reimagined Cooper as an alias of the god of mischief himself. Each new portrayal did not just keep the mystery alive, it amplified it. What made D.B. Cooper so enduring was not only the crime itself, but the questions left behind. If he had survived, what kind of life did he lead afterward? Did he watch his own legend grow on television, smiling from the shadows as the world speculated? Or did he perish in the forest that stormy night, his body never found, his story unfinished? For the American imagination, those questions did not weaken the legend, they strengthened it. D.B. Cooper became a symbol of mystery itself. The man who challenged authority, bent reality, and walked away without leaving a trace. And as the years passed, one truth became clear: even if the FBI never solved the case, the name D.B. Cooper would never be forgotten. For decades, the D.B. Cooper case was kept alive not only by public fascination, but also by the relentless determination of investigators. The FBI poured countless hours into tracking down leads, analyzing evidence, and re-examining every piece of the puzzle. Yet by the 2000s, it had become clear, the trail was colder than ever. Witnesses from the night of the hijacking were aging. Some had already passed away. Potential suspects had either died or grown too old for meaningful interrogation. And the physical evidence, his tie, cigarette butts, and the money found on the Columbia River had yielded little progress. Even advances in DNA technology had not provided a definitive breakthrough. Finally, in July 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI made a historic announcement. They were officially closing the D.B. Cooper case. The Bureau explained that resources needed to be shifted toward more urgent, modern threats such as terrorism and cybercrime. Cooper's file, while legendary, no longer held priority. The decision marked the end of the longest and most exhaustive manhunt in FBI history. More than 1,000 suspects had been investigated, ranging from war veterans to petty criminals, and from desperate loners to respected professionals. Yet none could ever be linked definitively to the man who vanished into the stormy night of 1971. When the news broke, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as inevitable. After nearly half a century, the chances of finding Cooper alive or uncovering new evidence were slim. Others were frustrated, believing the case deserved to remain open, if only for symbolic reasons. After all, D.B. Cooper was more than a criminal. He had become a cultural icon, a mystery woven into the fabric of American history. Even though the FBI had closed the official investigation, the mystery was far from buried. Amateur sleuths, independent journalists, and curious members of the public continued to pursue their own theories. Online forums buzzed with speculation. New documentaries and podcasts revisited old evidence, hoping to uncover details that had been overlooked. Some enthusiasts even launched private expeditions into the forests of Washington and Oregon, convinced that Cooper, or at least the rest of his ransom money, was still out there waiting to be discovered. The FBI's closure of the case did not provide answers. It only underscored how enduring the mystery really was. For 45 years, one man had managed to outwit America's most powerful law enforcement agency. By formally stepping away, the Bureau seemed to acknowledge what many had long suspected: D.B. Cooper's secret might never be solved. And yet, the legend continued to grow. Every article, every television special, and every new prime suspect announced to the public only reinforced the story's mystique. Even as an unsolved file, the case lived on in the imagination of millions. For the families of those who had spent years under suspicion, the closure brought a strange kind of relief. For the rest of the world, it was a reminder that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved, not because investigators lacked skill, but because the story itself transcended fact. D.B. Cooper was not just a man. He was an idea. And when the FBI closed his case in 2016, that idea was not extinguished. If anything, it became even stronger, leaving the world to wonder what really happened that night in 1971. When the FBI closed the case in 2016, they left behind more than a file. They left behind a void filled with endless speculation. For every theory dismissed, another one would rise. And even though investigators had no definitive answers, the public continued to spin countless possibilities about what really became of D.B. Cooper. The first and perhaps most logical theory is that Cooper never survived his daring jump. Supporters of this idea point to the obvious dangers, the stormy weather, the freezing temperatures, the rugged terrain below. Cooper had leapt into thick forests and icy rivers wearing nothing more than a suit, loafers, and a raincoat. Without survival gear, he would have been exposed to hypothermia within hours. The fact that much of the ransom money never appeared in circulation also suggests he never lived to spend it. To many, Cooper was simply swallowed by the wilderness that night. But others refused to believe such a carefully calculated plan could end so abruptly. This leads to the second major theory, that Cooper not only survived, but managed to vanish into a new life. Perhaps he was a skilled paratrooper or ex-military survivalist, someone accustomed to harsh conditions. With $200,000 strapped to his body, he might have made his way out of the forest, hidden his identity, and lived quietly under a new name. Proponents of this idea point out how no bills ever surfaced in circulation, suggesting Cooper may have either held on to the money, exchanged it secretly, or hidden it permanently. Then there are the more elaborate theories, which lean toward the extraordinary. Some claim Cooper was part of a larger criminal network, and that his escape was pre-arranged with accomplices waiting on the ground. Others imagine him fleeing the country altogether, blending into another society where no one would recognize his name or face. Over the years, rumors surfaced that he might have been spotted in Canada, Mexico, or even as far away as South America. A few conspiracy-minded theorists even suggest Cooper was never meant to be caught, that perhaps he was connected to intelligence agencies, and that his hijacking had hidden motives beyond money. Was he testing airline security for the government? Was the ransom a smokescreen for something else? These theories, while less grounded, reflect just how much mystery still surrounds his identity. Among the most fascinating is the folk hero theory that Cooper lived out his life watching his legend grow. In this telling, he becomes less a criminal and more a trickster figure, smiling from the shadows as books, movies, and songs immortalized his name. Some believe he may have even left subtle clues over the years, taking quiet satisfaction in watching investigators chase ghosts. Ultimately, none of these theories have ever been proven. Not a single piece of definitive evidence has surfaced to confirm whether D.B. Cooper died in the forest that night or walked away to freedom. What is remarkable is that each theory is equally possible and equally impossible to disprove. And perhaps that is what keeps the legend alive. In a world where so many mysteries eventually find answers, the story of D.B. Cooper remains untouchable. Whether he perished in the storm, started a new life, or became something larger than life, his fate is still one of the greatest unanswered questions in modern history. Decades after that stormy November night, people still ask the same question: why does the story of D.B. Cooper remain so captivating? Many other crimes have faded into obscurity, yet this one continues to inspire books, documentaries, podcasts, and even blockbuster films. The answer lies in the unique blend of mystery, daring, and symbolism that defines Cooper's legend. First, there is the sheer audacity of the act. Airplane hijackings were not uncommon in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But none were carried out with such precision, composure, and theatrical flair. Cooper did not storm the cockpit with violence. He did not harm passengers. Instead, he orchestrated his plan like a professional operation, down to the smallest details, the choice of the Boeing 727 with its rear staircase, the demand for multiple parachutes, the specified speed and altitude. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. That sense of calm intelligence is what set him apart. Then there is the great unknown. Most true crime stories eventually deliver an answer: an arrest, a conviction, or at least a body. But Cooper left nothing but questions. Did he live or die? Did he spend the money, or leave it buried? Who was he in real life? These unanswered questions turned him from a hijacker into a mythic figure. Someone who could be endlessly debated but never fully understood. In a way, the lack of closure is what guarantees the story's immortality. Another reason for the case's enduring appeal is the duality of Cooper's image. To law enforcement, he was a criminal who put lives at risk. But to much of the public, he became something else entirely, a kind of outlaw folk hero. Unlike many hijackers, he treated the crew politely, released the passengers unharmed, and carried himself with dignity. He was not seen as cruel or bloodthirsty. Instead, he embodied the fantasy of the mysterious gentleman thief, the kind of figure found in novels and films, not in real life. There is also the symbolic timing. The 1970s were an era of social unrest, distrust of authority, and fascination with rebellion. Against that backdrop, D.B. Cooper's story felt like a real-life rebellion against the system, a man who beat the odds and outsmarted the most powerful authorities in the country. Whether or not he survived, he became a symbol of defiance, of slipping through the cracks in a world where everyone is expected to be accounted for. The cultural impact only reinforced the intrigue. With each movie, TV reference, or song lyric, the mystery gained new life. Younger generations who were not even born when the hijacking occurred grew up hearing about Cooper as though he were a character from legend. The myth became self-sustaining. The more people retold it, the larger it grew. Finally, the enduring appeal of D.B. Cooper lies in the fact that his story gives everyone a role to play. For investigators, it is the ultimate unsolved case. For writers and filmmakers, it is a ready-made thriller. For the public, it is a mystery to debate over coffee, late-night TV, or online forums. Everyone can imagine their own ending, their own version of what really happened. And so, D.B. Cooper continues to fascinate not just because of what he did, but because of what we do not know. He represents both the limits of authority and the limitless possibilities of mystery. In him, people see not just a hijacker, but a puzzle that refuses to be solved. And so, we reach the end of the story, or rather, the point where the story stops and the mystery begins. Nearly 50 years have passed since D.B. Cooper vanished into the stormy skies of the Pacific Northwest, yet the world is no closer to knowing the truth than it was on that November night in 1971. The facts are simple: a man boarded a plane, made an outrageous demand, collected a ransom, and parachuted into history. But beyond those bare facts lies a tale that refuses to die. Did he perish in the cold? His body hidden forever by the wilderness? Did he quietly slip into a new life, blending into the background as the world hunted for him? Or did he simply become an idea, a living legend whose true fate may never be known? That is the power of the D.B. Cooper mystery. It is not just a story about crime or investigation. It is about the allure of the unknown, the way unanswered questions capture our imagination more powerfully than any solved case ever could. In Cooper, people see something larger than life, a symbol of risk, rebellion, and the human fascination with secrets we can't quite unravel. Even today, D.B. Cooper's name still sparks debates, theories, and speculation. He lives on in books, documentaries, movies, and even internet forums where new generations of amateur detectives try to solve the unsolvable. Each theory adds another twist, but none provides closure. Perhaps that is exactly why the story endures, because closure would strip it of its magic. As we close this chapter, one truth remains: D.B. Cooper walked onto that plane as a man, but he leapt into the night as a legend. His story is proof that sometimes reality can be stranger and more captivating than fiction. Before we end, let me turn to you. What do you think really happened to D.B. Cooper? Do you believe he perished in the storm? Or do you think he lived a quiet life, watching the world chase his shadow? Share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your theories. And if you have enjoyed diving into this incredible mystery, do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. We have many more stories like this one coming up, tales of history's greatest unsolved puzzles, legends that defy explanation, and mysteries that keep us up at night. Thank you for watching, and for joining me on this journey through one of the most daring and mysterious crimes in modern history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and never stop chasing the unknown.